What is happening, everybody? Welcome to Off the Rails, a recovery podcast dedicated to ending the stigma of addiction through open discussion on all things recovery related. My name is Mark, and with me always are Dave and Jared. Today we have a special guest all the way from Glasgow. We got Tom Delaney. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
You all right? Unfortunately, I don't sound Scottish, though, which I'm sure disappoints you all, especially Dave in the Scotland top.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, Tom. So like we mentioned before, we want to have our guests on and kind of come on and share their stories and hope that we can help other people that might be struggling. And so whatever you want to kind of get into or not get into is up to you. Your story to tell. And we're just so pumped that you're able to take some time to join us today. So appreciate that.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute honor and a privilege to come on your show and more importantly talk about addiction, because as I'm sure you guys are familiar, it's such a stigmatized and demonized subject that as soon as you mention it, it's very taboo and no one wants to talk about it. And a lot of that is because of the sort of negative thoughts that we instantly have when we think about addiction. But just before we were on camera, before we started filming, we were talking about I mentioned the fact that I'm in the respect, just as much as I've met or any other addict that I've met, I think the thing that we all have in common is trauma or adverse childhood experiences. And for me, when I think about my childhood, it was certainly during my childhood that, I went through so many different adverse childhood experiences, and I went through very deep and traumatic experiences that really truly shaped my life, whether I wanted to accept that or not. There was a lot of things that happened to me which were wrong, and throughout my entire life I never really spoke about it, and the reason why I guess I didn't speak about it was because I was brought up in a strict sort of Catholic Irish family, and I was born and raised in Ireland in a beautiful place called Nina in Tipperary, and my parents both Irish as well, sound Irish though still. And we relocated from Ireland to London when I was around about 3 or 4 years old. And there's a saying in Ireland, and it never really made sense to me until I got into recovery, and I kind of think about it now. And it's there's no such thing as an alcoholic. There's just a man that likes a drink, and that's quite a cultural expression. And when you think about that culturally, I mean, that's really concerning. That people still don't even register the fact that alcoholism is an issue, because they just sort of dampen it down and say, oh, they just like a drink. And unfortunately, my father was and still is, as far as I'm aware today, still a raging alcoholic. But I also think he has quite a lot of underlying issues which he's never addressed. And I think that it's been passed down from generation. I do not believe addiction is a disease, but I do believe that we grow up in an environment that elicits certain behaviors where it will make you eventually turn to other things to give you pleasure or to mask the pain. And for me, that's what I certainly did in my addiction. But my childhood was very traumatic. I witnessed a lot of things that, like domestic violence and things even worse than that, which no human being should really witness, especially an innocent little child. And my mum and dad, thankfully, broke up when I was about 12 years old. And I always used to blame myself for my father's ways. I used to think that I wasn't good enough. I never felt like I was loved. I always felt like sometimes my mum sort of focused on other areas of her life, which I felt that she was doing it as a way of escapism as well. But I always blamed myself for my dad's behaviors. I always thought that it was me that made him like that. I thought, and I've got 2 younger brothers, Patrick and Sean, and they're younger than me. There's sort of 5 years difference between all 3 of us, but I think sometimes, and thankfully, maybe they were too young to remember some of the stuff that went off, but they're certainly old enough to understand that there was a lot of things that went off in our household that certainly wasn't right, and wasn't certainly healthy either. But we used to, well, I'll speak for myself, but I feel like my brothers feel the exact same as me, and I used to blame myself. I just used to think that I wasn't good enough to be loved, and that's why my dad did what he did, and that's why my mum had her behaviours. And it's odd because, like, my mum isn't an addict. She has never, as far as I'm aware, touched a drug. She doesn't even really drink. Like I've probably only ever seen my mum drink alcohol twice, and both of those occasions I thought it was really strange because I've never seen my mum drink. But my father drank enough for the both of them and everyone else that probably lived in London and Ireland as well. And that left a lot of deep scars. But I wasn't aware of that until I was sort of in my late 20s. I always had these underlying issues of never feeling good enough and never felt like I fitted in. I didn't feel like I fitted into society. But especially I didn't feel like I belonged in my family. I always felt that I was the odd one out. I always felt that it was my fault. I always used to blame myself for my mother and father's relationship breakdown. I used to blame myself for my father's addictions because I used to think that, I mean, I haven't spoken to my father in years, but as far as I'm aware, he's still the same person pretty much. And he still gambles as well. He's a chronic gambler. And thankfully, I didn't see too much of him during my childhood. He was absent. It was absent quite a lot. But when we did, he made sure that we sort of regretted it. Like it wasn't any pleasurable or sort of meaningful memories that I have with my father, which is tragic to say that. You know, I think when you think about your parents, they should be like your superheroes. Your mum and dad should be the people that you epitomize and idolize for a whole manner of different reasons. But for me, you know, I didn't really feel like I was loved. Definitely more so by my father than my mother. But I really struggled with that for years. And I mean, when you're a little kid, like, how do you tell to someone or your friends that, you know, your dad, you know, beats your mum up, or there's a lot of domestic violence and, you know, and there's all this other stuff. Like, who do you talk to as a child? And I always it was always bred into me that the troubles that went off in our household stayed in our household. And I think that's quite a common thing for a lot of people. All the issues that we were going through, you know, you were told, like, don't tell anybody, don't speak about anything. You know, and I was warned by my father loads of times after certain things that happened. You know, I was told never to say anything. So I was, you know, I was shit scared. But I think mentally I tried to block a lot of the pain out by acting out in other ways. So when I was a child, I was quite intelligent at school. I didn't really struggle academically, but I did have, I guess, a few behavioral issues. I wouldn't say I was a naughty kid, but I was certainly like a class clown, and I thought I was a little comedian, and I would be very challenging to teachers. And it wasn't until a few years ago, actually, that I realized, but I think the reasons why I was so sort of abrupt and resistant to adults or teachers, because for me, they represented an adult, and my father was such a pain in my life that I think the only way that I could take it out was I viewed the teacher as an adult figure like my father. And I knew that I could get away with sort of back chatting to a teacher and I wouldn't get punched in the face. Whereas if I did that to my father, you know, that would have certainly happened and at times did happen. So I wouldn't say I was particularly naughty, but I was definitely a class clown. And I always used to try and make everyone laugh. And I think ultimately I just wanted to be loved. You know, I wanted everybody to like me. You know, and I never really suffered with, you know, I was never really bullied at school. I guess to a certain degree, everyone's exposed to a slight form of bullying in some way, shape or form, whether it be like mentally or physically. But I don't think there was anybody at school that could have done anything half as bad as what my father did to me or what my stepdad did to me later in life. You know, so thankfully I never did, but all of my issues were at home, you know, so it didn't really matter if I got bullied at school because I'd go home and I'd get far worse. But school was, I think most kids hate school for a variety of different reasons. But for me, I loved going to school because when I went to school, I wasn't at home. I wasn't terrified or anxious about my father coming home or would he be going to work or would he be coming home with, you know, constantly hearing my mum and dad shouting and screaming at each other. You know, I witnessed some terrible things as a child, but like, it's really weird because sometimes at school you're asked like, what's, you know, like a favorite memory or like what's something that like inspired you. And I tell this story So as well as being a student, I'm also a public speaker. And so when I do my talk, sometimes I share this story and everybody's always really baffled by it. But like one of the happiest memories this will sort of give you just an insight into how my childhood was. But one of the happiest memories of my childhood was, unfortunately, my father used to be, very sort of violent and abusive to my mum especially. And I remember on this certain occasion, he came home drunk and they were arguing as always. And he punched my mum, and I know it hurts her anyway. If you punch someone with intent, it generally seems to hurt. But it sounded like it was a lot harder and a lot more abrupt than normal. And she managed to get off the floor and she ran straight into the kitchen, and my father chased her. And my mum actually grabbed a kitchen knife and pinned him to the fridge and told him if he didn't fuck off, that she would kill him. And if she didn't kill him there and then, she would slit his throat in his sleep. Now that might sound really like something out of a horror film, but that is literally one of the happiest moments of my life, because for the first time in my life, I saw my mum stand up for herself. Now I don't condone violence, but I think in that instance, she did the right thing. And I've got no doubt in my mind that my mum would have killed my father if he didn't leave. And eventually my dad shit himself because he was bullies aren't necessarily brave people. That's why they tend to be bullies. But he left, and he tried to worm his way back in. And my parents had a habit of breaking up, getting back together, breaking up, getting back together. And I think my mum did it to try and keep us together as a family. But ultimately, it was just the wrong decision each and every time. He'd say he would change, and he'd have probably all good intentions of actually changing, but he could just never do it. And there's a whole variety of reasons for that as well. But ultimately, we ended up moving. So I grew up in Hackney in London from like 3-4 years old to being about 12, and then we moved from London to South Yorkshire. In Barnsley, which is like this sort of weird accent that I've got now. So I went from having an Irish accent to a Cockney accent to then this like Northern English accent, and now it's a little bit messed up. But for the first time, most people, I think when you're a child, like when your parents break up, it's like a really big deal. And generally speaking, it's quite a traumatic time, but it wasn't like that for us. We loved it. And I can speak for my brothers and my mum when I say that we absolutely loved getting away from my father and getting away from London. London's a big city. We moved to a house that had like a front and back garden, and all of this was like a completely new experience. And I wasn't scared of meeting new people or changing schools or going to a new school or any of that. Ultimately, I knew that we were moving to get away from him. And that was the best thing. That was the best thing that my mum probably ever did. But unfortunately, it was only good for about a year or so. And unfortunately, she met another guy. And my mum seems to have this type, which is all sort of like just, can I swear? Is that oh, no. Just wankers, basically. Just like complete arseholes that they're all severely messed up in their heads. They've all got issues with substance abuse. Like generally speaking, she goes for the same sort, which is like alcoholic gamblers that are violent and abusive. And she met this guy who seemed obviously nice at first, but again, he had his own issues. But that isn't a justification of how you act. I mean, we've all got issues, but it's not an excuse for how you act and treat others. And he was not as much like physically violent, but mentally worse than my father. And I think for me, what it instilled into my ideas and my self-worth and belief was, right, so your dad hated you. That's why he did what he did, and he treated you like he did, and he treated your mum and your brothers the same, because you're not worthy enough to be loved, and you're a horrible little human being. And then when it's just another guy that's not your father, and then he treats you the exact same, it kind of confirmed and affirmed that idea that I'm just a waste, just a useless piece of shit that doesn't or ever will feel love from my parents. And that was a very difficult time, especially sort of when you're going through puberty and all that, because I was like 12 to like, he was there from being like 12 to about 18, maybe even a bit longer. But when you're sort of going through that sort of prepubescent, sort of that pubertic stage where you start to question the world around you, you start to think, you have ideas and thoughts that you never had when you were a child. And I always used to sort of think about how I was treated, and it used to really affirm the idea that I was useless, you know, that I didn't deserve any happiness. I didn't deserve to be loved. I actually deserved being bullied and treated like the way I was. You know, and I still talk to my mum to this day, and I love mum to bits, but sometimes we have a very difficult relationship. But you know, we work together at it. You know, it's whereas with my father, we just don't speak, and I think that's tragic. But I think also I'm old enough now and ugly enough to know that, you know, I hope he changes. I wish I'd fucking love it if he did. I really would. But I know it's very pessimistic, but for me, it's just easier if I just accept the fact that, right, he's probably not going to change. And as Trump, you know, as sort of devastating as that is, at least I'm not sort of building my hopes up and having them crushed, because I did that all my life. You know, I've always kind of hoped that my father would change, or there's been times when I've sort of like moved back to Ireland for a while, or I moved back to London sort of in my late teens, early 20s, and I thought that I tried to build a relationship with him, and it was just horrible. Like it's so uncomfortable. Even when I was with him, it was very uncomfortable, and it just made me feel very on edge. You know, I as much as I'd love to hug him and, you know, wish everything was all right, on the same hand, you know, on the other hand, sorry, you know, I'd love to punch his face in and not stop. So it's a very, you know, it's very disturbing. So for me, I just cut my ties, and it's easier. And, you know, for me, in some respects, it's easier because I'm not hoping, you know, I hope that it does change, but, you know, unfortunately, I can't see it. And it's a shame, you know, but, you know, that's his choice and it's what he wants to do. So, but yeah, so I moved around a lot. I ran away from home quite a few times as a child, so in my teenage years. And until I was like sort of 16, 17, I moved out from home. I hated being at home because we'll just call him my stepfather, even though he isn't. My mum aren't together anymore. I haven't been for a long time, but he had that role. You know, he had I guess, an element of responsibility, and also someone that I should have looked up to and admired in some way, shape, or form. But no, there wasn't any of that at all. It was horrible. And he had 2 children with my mum, my little brother and sister. And for years, like, I'm quite ashamed to say this, but for years, I hated them. They were always treated very different than me and my brothers, Patrick and Sean. I always felt like once they were born, it was 2 families. It was them and it was us. And I think I've always kind of felt like that. It was always like them being my father and us being my mum and my brothers. And then it had transformed from that to it's them, which is this bloke, my mum, and their new kids. And then it's me and my 2 brothers. And I thought when I left that the troubles would have stopped. But unfortunately, they didn't. So rather than him bullying and tormenting me and doing the things that he used to do, he then started to bully and, you know, be quite violent and abusive, physically abusive, to my brothers. And I never knew about that. And years later, my brother told me, and I cried my eyes out. And I felt disgusted that I should have been there to protect him. And I kind of ran off to London, started a new life. And they were going through what I was going through. I thought it was just me. And that, when I keep saying that, because I did think it was just me. I just thought it was me that didn't deserve any love or any attention or any kindness or compassion or anything like that. But I think my younger brother, especially Sean, like, it's brought us like really close together, especially now I'm in recovery. But eventually, you know, it drove me away from my family. It drove me away from myself. And, you know, eventually it drove me into choosing drugs, which is quite weird because I think as a child, if you ever met me as a child, I was always against drugs and alcohol because I assumed that if you drank, you turned into my dad, or you turned into my stepdad, and they weren't nice people. So for me, I wasn't one of those kids that like would drink on a school field and, you know, run away and sort of drink or come home and sneak in. And that wasn't me. But then I eventually, I think I was at college. I was at Barnsley College, studying fashion design and textiles, and I got introduced. Like at this point, I would go out and drink every so often, but to me, it wasn't drinking. To me, going out and sort of living in that environment and being young, I had friends, so it was a completely new social circle for me. And I had a bunch of friends that I felt loved. I felt a part of this little group. I was going to say gang, that might be the wrong word. But like, you know, I felt part of this little group of people. And I loved going out and meeting new people and just chatting shit and, you know, trying to forget about all my issues and just sort of living in that moment of being away and being free. But unfortunately, one day, the friends that I used to hang around with, and still some of them today, they were quite a few years older than me. And they were always like, you know, quite good looking people, very popular with women. I was sort of 16, 17-ish, and I was sort of like at that age, sort of becoming like interested in girls. And I was always really shy, which when I say to people that would never believe me, because I was probably very like sort of outgoing. But inside I was incredibly shy. And I think I used to hide it by being a bit more extroverted probably than normal. But I remember talking to one of my friends and I said, like, how do you like talk to all these girls? Like, why are you not scared or shy? And he just laughed and he went, why would you be scared? And I think for me, I've always had that fear of rejection because I've been rejected by probably, you know, fundamentally some of the most important people in my life. And I always felt, I think when I've sort of analyzed my life, I've always felt that it was fear of rejection that was the issue. And he was like, it's easy. And then he sort of flippantly and joked. He says, well, it's easier when you've got cocaine in you as well, like when you've got coke in your system. And I was like, what's that? Like, that's how naive I was. And at this point, I was sort of 17, leading up to 18. And he was like, oh, well, I've got some if you want to try it. Now, at this point, like I was always very anti-drugs, never thought about taking them, never sort of had any interest or sort of desire to do it. And it wasn't peer pressure either. Like he never forced me to. He just asked and I just went, yeah, all right then. I was like, I'm not going to die. And he was like, no, don't be stupid. But obviously, you know, people do die from taking drugs even for the first time. And we went down this little sort of journal at the back of this Greg's shop that used to be in the center of town. And he got it out and he was sort of crushing it. And I was that naive that I didn't even know how to snort it. I was like, what do I do? And he was like, well, you roll a note, you put it in and you take it. So the first time I tried, I actually blew it out. So I didn't know what I was doing. Unfortunately, I became very good at doing it at one point. But then the first time I didn't know what I was doing. I actually blew it away and he started kicking off. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what to do. Like, I'll pay for it. Like, don't worry. So then he went, right, have another go. So then I did it again, but I absolutely snorted like half of this bag. So I took a lot and it kicked in like really fast. And I think, you know, we'll all remember our first time of anything. And for me, I remember like it literally took a few minutes and I felt that like sort of, I hate sort of like, sounds like I'm romancing over it, but like that sort of tingling shiver, it was cocaine as well. So it was like all the way up my spine and it just like snapped in my brain. And I was like, oh shit, like, what is this? and I loved it. You know, and instantly I think I was completely hooked. I absolutely loved how I felt. I loved how it broke down barriers for me internally, that I wasn't scared to speak to people. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't fearful of rejection. And I went out that night and, you know, I had probably one of the most amazing euphoric nights I've ever had in my life. But that sort of honeymoon period doesn't last long. You know, I was a drug addict for the best part of 12, 13 years. And I only probably enjoyed taking drugs for about a year. And I genuinely mean that. And I don't want to say that to any listeners thinking, oh, great, I can take coke for a year and then stop. Because if everyone can do that, then, I wouldn't have been in the state I was in the end. But then I quickly became addicted to cocaine. I also don't like saying this either, but it was manageable to a degree. Like I could go to college, I could go to work, I could, I wouldn't sit at home and be snorting it every single day. But then gradually it became worse and worse and worse. And I ended up losing a job over it because I basically had an overdose. I'd been partying all weekend at a hotel, like thinking I was some baller, like everyone does at that age. And I didn't sleep for went out, I think Thursday. It was like a bank holiday weekend, so there was no work. I think it was Friday and Monday, or Monday or Friday, one of the two. And I'd literally gone out. We went back to this hotel and we didn't leave this hotel for sort of 2 or 3 days, which is disgusting. I think about it now, it was horrible. But in that moment, I loved it. And I went to work and I collapsed. I'd actually had a line of coke in the toilet before I sat at my desk. And as I sat at my desk, I passed out. And my boss at the time was also an I think he was like a police constable. He was in the police force, but I think he was like CID or something. So he was a bit more probably aware of drugs than your usual police officer. And rather than helping me or talking to me, I got sent to hospital. Once I got discharged, I had a voicemail from him saying, look, you're fired. Don't bother coming back. If there's anything you want to collect from your desk, then I'll send it to you. Do not come to these premises. That's it, done. And I thought, well, I hated that job anyway. I was always trying to make it positive. I was like, I didn't want to work there anyway. And what I did was I completely failed to recognize the severity of what had just happened. So then not long after that, I moved back to Ireland for about 6 months. Didn't take drugs, didn't touch drugs. Went out and drank a few times, but that was it. And then I came back and I spent 1 day in Barnsley, and then I moved to London. And I lived there for about three and a bit years. Again, sort of in my late teens, early 20s. And again, it was manageable. I was one of those guys that could get up, like probably most functioning addicts or highly functioning addicts. I could get up Monday morning, go to work, do my job, do it well. And, Friday night, or even Friday at work, I'd be like, right, I need X amount of bags of cocaine, blah, 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 pills and this. And I'd be ordering the drugs, get them all sorted while I'm at work. And then, but straight after work, go out, party Friday, Saturday, probably led into Sunday. And then I'd stop. And then I'd go to work. And that sort of period lasted for a couple of years. And it wasn't until I was about I was probably about 19 or 20. And I used to visit Barnsley every so often. And when I lived in London, I used to come back, see my family, and go out. And I got introduced to ketamine, which was the drug that almost killed me. And I despised ketamine. I don't know if you call it, we call it ket. I presume you call it the same thing, but everyone assumes it's a horse tranquilizer. It's not. It's just an anesthetic that's used in a lot of doctors or hospitals as well as veterinary practices. But the reason why I used to hate it was probably the most unsociable drug that I'd ever seen. So I had quite a lot of good, really good friends that were, very popular, good looking, cool sort of people, nice people as well. And, they'd be at that stage of my life, it was all about going out and sort of pulling girls, right? Which is really sad when you think about it. But that's what I did. And I think we'll all go through that phase. And I think you have to go through it to realize later in life how sort of silly and meaningless it is. But I guess you can learn from it. And my friends would they'd be, we'd be having a laugh, and then all of a sudden they'd hide around the corner and they'd all have a few keys of ket. And then that's it. They'd be like a zombie. And literally dribbling, doing all these weird things. And then everybody'd be laughing, and you'd be sat there. At this point, I still took a lot of cocaine. And I'd be like, oh, what a dick. Do you know, I'd be like, come on, we've been having a good night, and now like you need an ambulance, like you need to go home. So you go into like a K-hole or a ket-hole, what I don't know what you guys call it, we call it a K-hole.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and you've just got like no concept of reality. I mean, you don't really have much of that in addiction anyway, but you especially don't in a K-hole. And I always used to think like, God, that's a disgusting drug. Not that, you know, cocaine's not much better, but at that point in my life, you know, I thought cocaine was a much safer and glamorous. And, you know, cocaine is glamorized. You know, you don't see people like there's loads of Netflix documentaries or films, and they all portray this life of cocaine, you know, being very glamorous and exquisite. And that's not the case. Like with any drug. I remember once my friend used to mix it, CK it was called, so it was like cocaine and ketamine. And I tried it and I never felt anything. And I was like, oh, that doesn't do anything. It's shit. And he went, oh, well, just try it with ket. And I remember trying it, and I literally, again, went stupid and had like this massive line. And I must have been out of it for about 4 hours. And I cannot remember a thing. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I like that. And then I tried it again and again and again. But me and two of my friends in the beginning, we used to like buy a gram to share. And this is like very, very early on. And like sort of early 20s. And we'd buy a gram between three of us, and it would last us on a Wednesday night. Used to be a student night if I went out in town. And it would last us like a Wednesday night, and then maybe Friday. And we might have to buy some more if we went out Saturday night. But that was like three of us. And like all things, you know, you become accustomed to it, you know, so the tolerance in your body and everything else, your mind and your body builds up really quickly. And I went from sort of in the beginning where a gram would last me and two of my mates, like 2 nights, possibly 3 nights out. You know, and we wouldn't do it for the day, so we'd save it just purely at night, and that was that. To then, you know, at my worst, the day I ended up going to rehab, I sniffed 36 gram in 10 hours, which is 3.6 grams an hour. And also I was traveling to Scotland on the trains to rehab as well. So if you can imagine, like I had to catch 5 separate trains, and I was up at 5 a.m. and I didn't get to rehab until I think midday. And from buying it, it had gone, and it was in something like 10 hours, a 10-hour period. I sniffed an ounce and a quart. And if you'd have seen me, like I was 6 stone and dying, but I wasn't fucked. Like I wasn't out of it. I certainly wasn't in a kettle. And that, like, I went through a stage in my life of sniffing like ounces a day, just going through it. Like as soon as I got up, and we used to call it like death lines, which ironically eventually ended up like that. And like I remember once I snorted, I think it was a meter line off my friend's kitchen table. And he was a quantity surveyor, so he had like one of them meter stick things. And I was like, no, I could do this, and like showing off, which is obviously not something you want to show off about. And I snorted it, and I was fucked for about 2 or 3 hours. But we kind of thought that was amazing. You know, we thought it was amazing to be able to snort that much, or to go out and do it. And you know, there was a lot of, unfortunately, I got involved in like the dark side of of drugs as well, where you know I became a drug dealer through sort of my sort of early 20s, and I ended up like just buying a bit extra, or I'd like buy an ounce to sell to my friends, so I could get like, you know, 4, 5, 10 gram for free and make a little bit of money. I never started doing that because I wanted to be a drug dealer, you know, and even at that point, I never imagined myself or viewed myself as a drug dealer. I just saw it as, well, all my mates are taking it. We're always messing about trying to run around and get it. So if I just get it, then everyone can just get it off me, and we're all out together, and it's just easier. And obviously then I make a bit for myself, and that pays my night out. And also I get, which is the real reason, which was I got plenty of free drugs. And I went from sort of dealing like, you know, grams on a weekend to kilos a day within a 6-month period. And unfortunately, it ended up I mean, I think when you get involved in especially when you get involved in addiction, but when you get involved in dealing drugs, I don't think that story like ever ends well. I mean, if you look at Pablo Escobar, it didn't really end well for him, or any other drug dealer. Like, it always either results in death or prison. And generally speaking, that is how it, I don't know anybody that could be like, oh, well, I haven't gone to prison or didn't get stabbed or anything like that. It's always very grim. But I ended up being robbed, and I got held at gunpoint by a bloke that actually owed my friend quite a lot of money through drugs. And he'd been set up, but unfortunately I lived with this friend at the time, and said friend wasn't in. I was, and I was kitty because I'd been rock climbing all day, and I came back and I wasn't going to go out, and it was just me in the house enjoying the quiet time being on Ket. And there was a knock at the door, which I thought was weird because our door was never locked. And as I walked down the stairs, I only had a towel on as well, so I was naked. And as I opened the door, he kicked it in, and it knocked me flying. It also knocked my towel off. So not only was I being held at gunpoint and robbed, but I was stark bollock naked and kitty, which is weird, not just for him, but also for me. But hopefully it was more weirder for him than it was for me. And then he ended up, he took I think it was about 6 or 7 kilos in their house at the time, which they knew were there because they'd ordered more drugs. That's how they knew it was there. And they stole all the money as well. But what happened was when the getaway driver drove off, he was Ketty as well. And he drove, sorry, my cat's. And when they drove off, the driver didn't have his lights on, and it was nighttime when it happened. And he was driving like an idiot all over the road. And it just happened that a police car drove past and saw them driving erratically, and obviously with the lights off, which was dangerous. Turned into a police chase. They crashed. The guy ran off, threw the gun. Money was like flying everywhere. Drugs was all over the car. And then they got obviously arrested. But rather than saying like stupidly what they said was the truth, it's a bit of a weird, it's a bit of a paradox. But they actually, rather than just saying, oh, it's our drugs and it's our money, they actually went, oh, well, we've just robbed this house, held the guy at gunpoint, stole the money, stole the drugs, and obviously their intent was to sell those drugs. So rather than getting done, they're obviously like world-class criminals. And it's really strange, actually, because I've bumped into both of those people since. One of them whilst I've been in recovery, and the other one whilst I was still a drug addict. And he actually apologized, both of them separately, which is all right, because one of them's like enters like these world strongman competitions, and like, he would kill me if he wanted to. But he apologized. He says, look, I'm sorry. It was just, I didn't know it was you that was going to be there and everything else. And I was all right. I says, oh, don't worry about it. And then the other guy, the getaway driver, eventually, only a couple of years ago, messaged me asking for help. And that really put me in a weird sort of situation, because I was like, no, you fucked my life up. Like, you're a little dick. But then also there was a part of me that like, well, you were a little dick. Do you know what I mean? It was me. I was a little dick as well. And I was like, well, he's reached out. That takes a lot of strength and courage to do that. So I was a bit torn whether or not to ignore him or to not ignore him. And the reason why he actually messaged me was, so like eventually I went into rehab, and I had a very successful career after I gave up dealing drugs. And I loved my job. I worked in the education sector, which is weird considering I was still a drug addict. I didn't look like one, because we all assume what drug addicts look like. And generally speaking, it's not highly functional drug addicts that wear an expensive suit and have loads of business meetings and go around the country meeting new people and selling them shit. And that's what I did. But I also did that because I wanted people not to know that I was a drug addict, because I thought the more successful I am, or the more I look like I've got money, or the more money I earn, or the better I do at work, or the more like the prettier the girlfriend I have, or the better cat, all this external material bullshit I used to have because I felt like I needed it, because deep down inside I was nothing. I was just and I hate to admit it, but I was worthless. My life was shit. You know, everything I had in my life, I had it for a purpose. And it was to appear that I wasn't a drug addict, you know, and that's terrible, you know, especially when you think about I was in a relationship with a girl at the time for, obviously I had like several relationships, but like at the time of sort of just before going into rehab, I was in a relationship and it was horrible for her. It must have been horrible for her. And, you know, she tried to help me. You know, I don't think I've ever been with a partner that hasn't tried to help me, but I never wanted the help. I'd go to counseling, or I'd go and pay, I think I paid like £80 for like these CBT sessions for an hour, and she used to make me pretend I was a tree. It didn't help. And also what I used to do is go to a bathroom first and snort a massive amount of cat, go back downstairs and then pretend I was a tree where my feet was the roots. And as enjoyable as that is, sometimes I still do that type of sort of relaxation. Like, it wasn't good when I was on drugs, you know, and I did that just to keep her quiet. So she would take me way outside. And I just think about the things that people tried, like people always ask me, like, do people help, or do people try? Yeah, of course people tried. You know, I had a lot of people in my life that really loved and cared for me, including, you know, family and friends. But I was never ready. And I never thought that my addiction was as bad as what it was, you know, and I don't think we do. And until we fully accept how messed up things are, then we'll never change. But I was made redundant in 2018, and I'd worked there for almost 7 years. About a month before, I found out I was being made redundant in January. I then broke up with my girlfriend at the time, I think on like Valentine's Day, which was the best thing I ever did for either of us, because now she's happy and I'm in a much, you know, I'm happy as well, in a much better place physically, spiritually, emotionally. And that was hard. And then, you know, I lost everything. I'd come out of a long-term relationship. I'd lost my career, and everything that I placed so much value and emphasis on to make me look like I wasn't a drug addict, I started losing. I lived in a beautiful apartment in the Peak District, and I then had to give up the lease on the apartment, which then sort of technically made me homeless. And I officially got made redundant in sort of April, May. And even though I was a drug addict, I used to cling on to the fact that I had this great career. And believe it or not, it gave me a sense of purpose and meaning. You know, I had something to go to, despite, you know, still using every evening and every weekend and every opportunity that I could that wasn't in work. And I worked from home at this period of time as well, which is quite dangerous sometimes. But I lost everything, including my health. My mental health was shot to bits. I had, you know, several suicide attempts. I ended up selling my car to pay a drug debt. I had to move back to my mum's. At the time, she was in a relationship with another generic arsehole, should we say. And it was horrific. And then I went from being relatively fit and healthy to literally losing half my body weight in a matter of months. I went down to 6 stone. And I looked what you would stereotypically imagine a drug addict to look like. And it's funny because I was a drug addict for 12, 13 years, maybe even 14. So from roughly being the age of 18 to 32. So what's that? 14 years. And I only looked what you would imagine a drug addict to look like for about 8 months, 9 months. And everyone, when I show people the image of what I look like, because I took some, I presume you've seen the pictures, and that's how it sort of, I think, Speaker initially, isn't it? So when people look at those images, they're like, oh my God, like that's what a drug addict looks like. But I was a drug addict for years before then, you know, and no one ever had an idea. No one had the even slightest inclination that I was a drug addict. But I was, you know.
What's happening, everybody? I hope you're enjoying Tom's episode so far. Tom's an amazing speaker, great dude. And make sure you check out part 2 to hear the rest of Tom's recovery journey. As always, please like, subscribe, comment, reach out to us. And if you're struggling with if you're struggling with addiction, please reach out and ask for help. Thanks for listening.